today. As I said, we have Jennifer Herz, Gary Groman and Jennifer Martin. Our first speaker today is Jennifer Herz. Jen is the founder of a company called Biointelect. Founded that in 2011 to provide strategic commercialisation services to the biopharmaceutical industry. She has over 20 years commercial business development and scientific affairs experience in the biopharm industry and has held a variety of roles with responsibility in Australia, New Zealand, Europe and international markets. She was the first managing director of Sanofi Pasteur in Australia, which was then a startup company and grew significantly over 6 years of her tenure in Australia. She's previously been a board member of Medicines Australia, where she led industry discussions with government related to new funding arrangements with vaccines on the PBAC. So Jen, I'm going to hand it over to you now and thank you for your presentations.
Thanks, Shani, for the opportunity to present today. I'm not going to talk directly about clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines, which will be covered by another speaker. Instead, I'm going to set the scene for some of the challenges we face, particularly in Australia, to actually secure access to a vaccine. At Biointelect, we work across the life sciences sector with universities, research institutes, biotech and medtech companies, as well as major pharmaceutical companies, both in Australia and overseas. This gives us a unique 360-degree view of the ecosystem. We currently have 6 clients with COVID-19 technologies, and over the last 8 years, we've completed multiple vaccine projects for many different vaccines at all stages of development, from preclinical right through to post-market. Next slide, please. You will have all read many articles about the various vaccines in development for COVID-19 and seen regular updates in the media. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, has stepped up to provide significant funding and technological support for the most promising candidates. This summary from an article published in May demonstrates the variety of different vaccine types that are under development on the right-hand side. The World Health Organization also has a COVID-19 vaccine landscape, which is regularly updated, and that shows that there are now 11 vaccines in phase 1 clinical trials. 2 overseas companies have already started their trials in Australia, Novavax and Clover Biopharmaceuticals, and of course there are local vaccine candidates soon to start trials coming from the University of Queensland. The CSIRO, through its Centre for Disease Preparedness, has partnered with CEPI to provide a preclinical ferret model on which to test selected COVID-19 vaccines. So at the basic research, preclinical and phase 1 clinical stage, Australia is punching above its weight. Next slide, please. This slide depicts typical vaccine development in a linear fashion and highlights some of the considerations from the regulatory perspective. The regulator has to approve the manufacturing site as well as the manufacturing process, and the clinical trials need to be conducted with materials that are manufactured in that site using a specific process and specific cell line. So you can see that manufacturing is defined early in the development process. Next slide, please. So also thinking about typical linear vaccine product development, you can see here the probability of success at each stage of development. If you multiply these out, you have a cumulative success rate of 12.5%. Another article published by a group in the Netherlands, which reviewed over 600 vaccine R&D projects in development over a 10-year period, concluded that the chance of successful market entry for a preclinical candidate prophylactic viral vaccine is 6%. Next slide, please. A review in Vaccine looked at the length of time for each stage of development and compared vaccines for pharmaceuticals. The overall development time from preclinical through to market authorization was over 14 years for vaccines compared to 12.7 years for pharmaceuticals. There are similar studies by Vaccines Europe thinking about market access delays between vaccines and pharmaceuticals. In a pandemic situation, of course, the traditional health technology assessment process may not apply, but planning for supply chain, development of the immunisation strategy and implementation of any vaccine programme will also delay access. Australia's public health response has been excellent compared to some countries, but we will more than likely rely on a vaccine manufactured overseas. Although, of course, since this talk, it has been announced by Seqirus that they are partnering to manufacture the vaccine made by the University of Queensland. Next slide, please. Vaccine manufacturing is long and complex. Production times typically take from several months in the case of influenza vaccine and up to 3 years for more complex vaccines like hexavalent pediatric combination vaccines. There is a lot of complexity and variability in the biological process. There are multiple steps involved in purification and quality verification to ensure safety. Each vaccine will have unique testing and release specifications to confirm purity, safety, efficacy, and stability. Obviously, there are shelf life considerations. Usually vaccines have a shelf life of between 1 and 3 years, and requirements to prove the cold chain during shipping. And finally, the vaccine must be in a suitable presentation for implementation in the population. Typically in Australia, we use pre-filled syringes with a specific needle size in single and multiple packs. So securing supply of those materials is also important, although some of those requirements for presentation may be waived in an emergency. Next slide, please. So we talked about CEPI and their support for vaccine development, and they're really challenging the traditional vaccine development paradigms. Their model anticipated that they would develop stockpiles of vaccines after phase 2A trials, expecting that they would undergo clinical trials during future outbreaks. In addition, CEPI will support development of platform technologies that could be adapted to, for example, disease X and be ready for emerging infectious diseases. The University of Queensland's molecular clamp technology is one such platform. So developing a vaccine in a pandemic situation will mean that multiple activities are started in parallel and at risk. Additional clinical trial material will be being manufactured before the results of phase 1 trials are known. Investment in manufacturing scale-up, considerations around possible tech transfer with the associated process development will also be necessary to ensure that large quantities of vaccine are available. We don't yet know which platforms will be scalable or which vaccines will be effective. Next slide, please. So thinking about supply, let's consider Australia's situation compared to the rest of the world. Our only domestic manufacturer is Seqirus, who manufacture seasonal and pandemic influenza vaccines, as well as Q fever vaccines in Australia. They have significant capability and capacity and were the first company to supply H1N1 vaccines to Australians in the 2009 pandemic. Up until now, their domestic capability has been restricted to egg-based vaccine manufacture, but of course there's been a recent announcement about their partnership with the University of Queensland and their capacity to also manufacture a recombinant protein vaccine should that vaccine candidate show that it's suitable. So often the bottlenecks in vaccine production relate to fill and finish. In the Northern Hemisphere, the US government have invested significantly in a fill-finish manufacturing network to address this and secure supply for the US. A similar initiative, albeit on a smaller scale, could permit Australia to import bulk vaccine for the local population. Next slide, please. In Europe, after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the European Council requested the Commission to start the preparation of joint procurement initiatives to procure vaccines in the context of a future pandemic. These provisions were finalised in 2013. As of March this year, the joint procurement article has been signed by 26 countries, including the UK, and will cover around 440 million people in Europe, which is about 98% of the population in the European Union. This joint procurement agreement defines the decision-making process as well as establishing the tender and the contract award. So there's now been a global collaboration called ACT to accelerate the development, production and equitable access to new COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines. It's still unclear how this how this will work and where Australia will sit in that priority list. Next slide, please. So thinking about creative ways to boost supply, this is a really interesting case study showing how Roche outsourced manufacturing to ensure sufficient availability for Tamiflu in the case of a flu pandemic. In the early 2000s, Roche invested in increased production capacity to support stockpiling activities and increase their capacity from 10 million up to 40 million courses. In October 2005, which some of you may recall was when avian influenza emerged and many countries began stockpiling H5N1 vaccine for pandemic flu, Roche issued an open invitation to third parties that would be interested in becoming involved in a Tamiflu manufacturing global supply network. And all in all up, they've secured 18 external partners in 10 different locations around the world who collaborate as part of this Tamiflu supply chain network. Through outsourced manufacturing of the drug to third parties, Roche can now produce up to 400 million treatment courses of Tamiflu if required. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think these examples highlight that Australia needs to do more to bridge the gap between early stage product development and commercial scale manufacturing. We are a sophisticated country with excellent research capability and a leading regulatory authority, but our geographical location and small population size does leave us vulnerable if we rely on imported products. There's an urgent need to map Australia's vaccine development and supply chain capability, quantify these gaps and identify where we're most at risk, and then we need to find innovative solutions. Scientists need to work with industry to ensure that government invests strategically to address those gaps. Given our location, it seems logical that we could be a regional supply hub for some products which would address needs of our more vulnerable neighbours, as well as improve sustainability. We could also identify innovative ways to have contracts for bulk supply with overseas manufacturers that would help secure access to a COVID-19 vaccine. COVID-19 has created an opportunity to advocate for this and hopefully secure additional investment from government and additional interest from all stakeholders. So that concludes my talk. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jen. And that was a great summary. And I'll hand over to Sue Mason to triage the questions. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Shani. I have one question here for Jenny Herz. This is a great presentation and clearly shows Australia could be a vaccine manufacturing destination. How do we get the Department of Health involved? It was a shame we had to send the Gardasil manufacturing off-site. Let's not see this happen again.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of the challenge is probably education about the complexity of product development and manufacture. The government's made significant investments in innovation with various biotech funds through the NHMRC, through the MRFF, and there's some great initiatives that are all stimulating basic research, but we really have a gap in product development and manufacturing, and that's what I was trying to highlight that. So I think the first step is to educate people so they understand complex product development and where the gaps are, and that's why I was recommending that some kind of audit of capability and gap analysis would be a great place to start. But beyond that, obviously, I think it really calls upon the sector to work together more than it does. I mean, I don't think Australia does as well as some countries in terms of industry and academic collaborations. And maybe we have that opportunity now with this sort of unprecedented level of collaboration that's happening with COVID-19. And on the one hand, yes, it's perhaps a little bit sobering for some of us hearing these talks that we might not be in the best position to have a vaccine in Australia. On the other hand, there's nothing like the present to stimulate this discussion and make sure it gets the attention it deserves in the future.
Thanks, Jenny. There's another question. What is the likelihood that we will see a revamped high-tech biotech manufacturing industry in Australia?
Well, that's a good question. I think the stage is quite well set for biotech to grow. I mean, certainly the biotech industry is more buoyant than it was probably 5 to 10 years ago. And if we can address those product development gaps I've talked about, that's going to benefit everybody, not just in the vaccine sector, but in New South Wales in particular, there's been huge leaps forward in stimulating initiatives from government for medical devices, and that's been fantastic to see. We now need to do the same with drugs, biologics, and vaccines.
Jen, to further your points were already well made. What is it going to take to get some form of manufacturing capacity up here in Australia if there was an opportunity for a vaccine, even if we found one here, how long and what would it take to get that happening?
So it is a bit of a piece of string question. I mean, there's on one level you can talk about bricks and mortar and what it takes to build a factory, and you can we looked into this for influenza, in fact, and we've you can find factories from 50 million to $500 million, and the difference in cost will depend on the technology that's being used, but in particular the people, the quality systems, the people that understand all the various analytical processes, process development, and all the quality control that comply with regulatory. So I guess what will it take in Australia? One, as I mentioned, some kind of evaluation of where we can strategically invest in something that makes sense is going to perhaps make a regional supply hub feasible. So it's absolutely clear that a factory's got to be sustainable, and it's therefore got to have a big enough population to have demand, and the Australian population is relatively small. So the first thing is thinking carefully about what it is we invest in and a technology that is valuable with potentially broad use in the region. The second, there's the bricks and mortar component, and that will probably take for these types of emerging infectious diseases where the business model's not very compelling for private sector investment. It will either take government money or it will take some kind of public-private partnership. And there have been conversations at multiple levels in government, Commonwealth government, about global health funds and that type of thing in Australia. I think it would be great if those discussions continue, and we're very fortunate that we have the chair of CEPI, Jane Holton, based in Australia, so I'm sure those conversations are continuing. And then thirdly, there's a huge skills gap. There's obviously a lot of great people working in pharmaceutical industry in Australia, but for the most part, with the exception of a small handful that are in manufacturing, we don't have a lot of expertise in manufacturing, process development, quality control, and all the things that you need to have a vaccine facility, for example. Seqirus clearly do. GSK, I think, have some local fill finish capability, but we need more skilled and training people. So I often feel like there should be some targeted migration program to get regulatory and quality and manufacturing people here, as no doubt everyone wants to live here, so we should use that to our advantage.
And I think this is probably another one for you, Jen. Has Medicines Australia been brought in on the need for the increase in vaccine manufacturing from our Oceania region?
I'm pretty sure they have. So Medicines Australia has been quite active in discussions, both with all of the heads of companies that are members of Medicines Australia, but also with government about supply chain sustainability. And in fact, they were planning an event on a topic similar to this, which I think will probably be rescheduled as a webinar soon. So certainly the discussions are ongoing and active. I'm not privy to all of them. But I guess the challenge for everyone is the starting point, which vaccine candidate is going to be the one to invest in. And as Gary said, probably there needs to be multiple. And maybe these kind of conversations need to happen globally and regionally so that there can be strategic solutions in multiple places in the world.